After the redrawing of the political landscape in France, in Italy, the UK, Spain, even we've talked about it on this show, Germany and the Netherlands, many wonder if it's now the turn of the European Parliament. With moves afoot to kick out Hungary's Fidesz party from the outgoing majority centre-right bloc, the EPP, Prime Minister Viktor Orban warns of what he calls useful idiots within that group that he claims could gift a new majority in next May's elections to the Social Democrats. The final straw for his fellow members, a publicly financed ad campaign that insinuates that current EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and Hungarian-born billionaire activist George Soros are in cahoots to unleash mass migration on Hungary. Juncker's own party belongs to the EPP, making this billboard campaign hard to ignore. Traditional European conservatives aren't just feeling the pressure to their right. This Tuesday, France's president appealed to EU citizens with proposals for a Europe that protects, as Emmanuel Macron puts it. How much of his platform steals the thunder of the conservatives, particularly when it comes to things like border policy? Can he actually build an alliance of like-minded Euro MPs when the last ballots will be counted on May the 26th? By the way, if it's any consolation for the center-right, the center-left is also tipped to lose seats. So if it's the beginning of the end of the old fault lines in the institutions that one institution that gets to ratify the next European Commission, what will Europe look like after these parliamentary elections? Today in the France 24 debate, should we be braced for change that Europe can believe in? Famke Krumbmuller is with us. She's the president of political consultants Open Cities. How are you?
Good, thank you.
We welcome back as well Ghez, director of the French business school HEC's Center for Geopolitics.
Thanks you for having me.
Nice to see you. From Brussels, Marco Gombacci, founder of the European Post, contributor to newspaper Il Giornale. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
And from Budapest, John O'Sullivan, the president of the Danube Institute think tank. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, an open letter by Emmanuel Macron, published this Tuesday in the French regional press and sent out in all the languages of the EU to the four corners of the continent. Erne Gunke has had a read.
It was one of Emmanuel Macron's central campaign pledges, reinforcing the European Union and taking on a leadership role in that pursuit.
It is up to us, to you, to define the only path that ensures our future, the one I wish to speak to you about today. It is the rebuilding of a Europe that is sovereign, united, and democratic.
Now, 3 months ahead of EU parliamentary elections, the French president is going on the offensive to pursue that objective. In a letter addressed directly to European citizens, President Macron outlined his vision for the future of the EU, with a list of suggested initiatives, all with the stated goal of strengthening European integration. Faced with concerns about the upcoming elections, Macron proposes the creation of an EU-wide agency tasked with protecting elections from foreign intervention and cyber attacks. The president has also suggested banning foreign powers from financing EU political parties. Amid the bloc's failure to resolve the political crisis over migration, the French president suggests reforming the Schengen area and centralizing EU migration policy. The reforms would include the establishment of a common border police force and a European asylum office, which would be based on unified standards for accepting and rejecting asylum requests. Emmanuel Macron's appeal also lays out suggestions for strengthening European leadership and progress. He urges EU leaders to reform trade policy, notably by banning businesses that compromise Europe's strategic interests. And with the goal of recovering the spirit of progress, he calls for European leadership in climate issues. To do so, the French president suggests the creation of a European climate bank to finance the ecological transition.
Famke Krumbmuller, lots of reactions have been coming in to this open letter. First of all, let's get yours.
Well, I find it surprising to the extent that he's addressing European citizens, but at the end of the day, the only people that can vote for him are the French, simply because his party until now is not represented in any of the European Parliament's groups, and he hasn't said what he will actually do after the election. So it's unclear. Let's say if I'm a German citizen and I read this in Germany and I agree, who do I vote for? Do I simply vote for the CDU because they are in power in Germany and I believe they will do that, or what do I do? So he addresses European citizens, but actually they can't do much apart from the French citizens.
And Germany has a coalition government. I've seen the reactions of varying within that coalition. The embrace of Olaf Scholz, the finance minister of these proposals, a more cautious approach from the government itself, though.
Across Germany, reactions have been quite positive, and there have been quite a lot of calls upon the German government to help France rather than stand in its way, so help Macron's European ambitions rather than to block them. Martin Schulz, also from the SPD, published this afternoon an op-ed also calling on the government to finally act. So, and with what I said before, that's what I think Macron, what he's ultimately doing is actually putting pressure on other European countries to follow suit, because they are the only ones that can react at this stage.
Because Macron knows this isn't the French presidential election where you can appeal directly to the people.
Exactly. Well, as I said, he can appeal directly to his own electorate, but that's only the French people and not the European.
Jeremy Ghez, some of the other reactions we've seen is people in Brussels saying, this stuff's great. We've all proposed it before.
Yeah. And the EU election might actually just be a pretext to basically impose himself as a leader. So nothing is new in there. There's a lot that has already been seen. But I think the approach might be slightly different. The two strongest themes I find in this letter are protection, number one, and to end the status quo. Protection, it's interesting. It's an interesting theme because I think it talks to people on the left, namely, let me try to protect you against the waves of globalization that has basically made you unemployed. But it is certainly, and even more explicitly, talking to a right-wing public, talking about the ability to protect frontiers. And the ability to do that synthesis, to me, that's something new. I see no political party today in Europe able to do so. I see just one Western political figure able to do this successfully to some extent. His name's Donald Trump. And interestingly enough, you take Macron, you take Trump, you have two very different people. And yet, the themes that they go after, the synthesis to basically try to overhaul how politics is done in Western democracies, I think is common. And I think this is exactly what he's trying to do, to bring about, I think, a new generation of leaders to say, yes, those themes, we all know about them, but he'd be in a good position to point to the previous generations to say, you failed. Now it's time to basically bring something new to the table.
This appeal, though, directly to the people and talking about protection, and isn't that railroading and bypassing the institutions that be?
Perhaps it's, except if, again, we're in the long run. If we're in the long run, I mean, there might be a generational issue to this. Angela Merkel could have a claim to be the European leader, but because of her weak political position, because she's been here for quite some time, I don't think that's exactly what she wants to achieve. I think that Emmanuel Macron brings to the table something that is somewhat a little bit different. I don't think he goes far enough. I think it remains extremely vague, and I think this is why the criticism is quite warranted to a large extent, but I wouldn't underestimate the opportunity for Macron to have a power play in all of this, especially at a time where he's basically saying, let me give you an image of Europe that even the UK can adhere to. And that's the conclusion of the letter. That makes me think that is actually the real power play he wants to make beyond these elections.
Marco Gombacci, do you agree?
Yeah, honestly, yes. I was a bit surprised by myself because I agree with both of your guests in studio. The analysis was very good, and I think that this analysis is shared also in Brussels, in the European institution. I spoke with a lot of functionaries, officers of the European Commission, the European Parliament, and they share the same analysis of the Macron's letter. If we think that he wrote this letter starting the electoral campaign, his own electoral campaign, probably trying to take voters from the populist or the sovereignist parties as well as in Italy, speaking about protectionism against globalization, protectionism against foreign like migration, etc. Is something new, and he's addressing not only his own voters, but he's addressing also different political parties. And I think that this letter, he wrote this letter in 28 different languages because he's not speaking just with the French voters, but he's trying to create a battle, a fight, political fight between the pro-Europe parties that has a vision of the future Europe and the sovereignist or the so-called populist parties that are trying to put their own national interest before the European interest. Also because I doubt about the existence of a proper European interest.
So you heard Famke's criticism at the outset, Marco. Whether or not it's a vote-getter, it can only be a vote-getter in France, since it's only the French that can vote for Macron's party?
No, because, for example, I'm Italian, and there is the centro-left parties, the Partito Democratico, who has its own new leadership, and they publicly said that the Macron letter is more than welcome also for Italy. And there is Sandro Gozzi, the former Minister for the European Affairs, who is one of the biggest supporters of Macron. And I think that this letter can has also an influence in Italy or in other parties, in other member states that has this fight between pro-Europe parties and Eurosceptic parties. So I don't think that it's vague just for France, but can be vague, but can has also an impact in different member states.
John O'Sullivan, hailing the letter as well, is Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, putting out a statement a short while ago saying that it's the, quote, starting point of a serious debate. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's quite a clever thing for Viktor Orban to say. I'm not sure it represents what will be the solid basis of the campaign of the Fidesz party in the election here. But on the more general points that you've been discussing, it seems to me that this is an appeal for more power to be taken from the member states and their democratically elected parliaments and concentrated at the European level. I don't think that that is a very sensible response to a political situation throughout Europe in which the anxieties of the voters are anxieties about too much centralization of power in Brussels. I also think that this was an interesting attempt by Macron to kickstart a campaign that he launched a year and a half ago, but which has failed so far, partly because the Germans have lost interest in financing it. And all of these initiatives, which seem very interesting, nonetheless, and may very well be popular when he presents them, if they require funds, those funds are going to have to come from someone. And my impression is that it is not in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, but throughout Europe, that there is what you might call, what's the word, exhaustion, with being asked to provide more money for major European projects. Certainly, I think the German electorate doesn't like it.
So do you agree with that, Famke? I mean, there are proposals in there, for instance, a new agency for the environment, a shored up mechanism when it comes to protecting borders, that anti-fake news mechanism, that's going to cost money at some point, right?
He definitely proposes a lot of new instances and agencies, which is completely against everybody who's skeptical about more centralization in Brussels. Certainly plays into the hands of the Brexiteers, for example, as well, saying, see, this is the future that is proposed for Europe. This is totally not what we want. Still, I would say he doesn't talk about financing at all in his letter. which I guess is a good thing for the German electorate. And we shouldn't forget that the Germans are probably amongst the most pro-Europeans in the EU at this stage.
Pro-Europeans, but are they willing to write the checks?
Right, but it's unclear at this stage that this would require any checks, right? That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think he talks, he kept it deliberately vague, which it doesn't, to the German electorate, this sounds more like a pro-European push, which I think is being well received, rather than talking about financing. And we shall all note that he didn't speak about any type of Eurozone reform, which I think is no coincidence, because that's when the German bells ring.
Yeah, there was this big speech a year ago at the Sorbonne, and where Emmanuel Macron laid out his vision to Europe. He talked a lot there about Eurozone finance reforms. Has he lowered his ambitions this time around?
It's not entirely clear to me that he has. And indeed, it's not entirely clear to me exactly that you actually need someone to write a check. I mean, when you talk about the ecological transition, for instance, you can leverage market funds. You can leverage the help from private sector as well. There's a recent report less than a year ago that appeared from the International Labour Organization that predicted that the ecological transition would destroy worldwide 6 million jobs, but create 18 million new jobs. So, of course, destruction of 6 million jobs, that's quite substantial when you think about it, especially that those 6 million aren't going to find necessarily and immediately and automatically a job in those 18 million. Right. So that transition is going to require time, and it's going to require some political protection. But that's a huge opportunity right there. 3 times as more jobs created by this ecological transition. You need the private sector to chip in. That might be another way to think about it.
All right, I'm turning here to the Frenchman in the room because people in this country are scratching their heads a little bit over one point, which is Macron making this grand appeal to Europe. This is the launch of his campaign for the European elections. We don't know who's going to head his list of candidates yet. Is it all about Macron and nobody else?
It's an interesting question, and perhaps the answer is yes. Another way to frame the question is to say, is it really about the European elections per se? Because we know that his party is in the lead. We know that this
even though we don't know who's going to be the head of their slate of candidates.
I'm almost sure that his party would probably say that's a proof of how genius he is, right? But more seriously, I just think that what's important here is just to remember who's the second party is the extreme right. He was able to basically completely erase any sense of quote unquote moderate opposition to his presidency. And now, because of branding, because of this exogenous forces, his true opponents are Viktor Orban and Matteo Salvini. And as a result of that, we don't even need to know who's going to represent Macron's list, in the sense that we know what Macron does not stand for. And I think there's a clear opposition right here, and this is what this letter is trying to basically put forward.
Doesn't matter who tops the list?
Well, that's how maybe, unfortunately, European elections have worked always. They are not really tied to a pan-European issue or a pan-European party. Macron has actually tried to create this pan-European list, and he failed. And he is still talking to the European people. But the way that the European elections works at the end of the day is national, and it doesn't really matter to the electorate that that a local politician who's not very well known, like it is unfortunately mostly the case in the European elections, heads the list. So then party leaders take that role, apart from that, the fact that they're actually not running for the European elections.
Themselves personally. When we come back, we're going to take a look at the point that Jeremy Ghez was talking about, how it's become Macron versus the populists. Where does it leave the traditional center-left and center-right? Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And the European election campaign, you could say, has kicked off with Emmanuel Macron's letter sent out to the four corners of the continent. We've been talking about it with our panel. Famke Krumbmuller, president of political consultants Open Cities. Jeremy Ghez, director of the French business school HEC's Geopolitics Center. Marco Gombacci, founder of the European Post and a contributor to Italian newspaper Il Giornale. And joining us from Budapest, John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute, a think tank. That open letter went out Tuesday. Sunday evening, though, Macron granted an interview to Rai Uno's popular Que Tempo Che Fa Sunday night talk show. There, France's president refrained from the kind of pointed attacks against Luigi Di Maio and Matteo Salvini that recently forced a recall of France's ambassador to Rome. But Macron was on message.
The spirit of the people is coming back. It's a deep-seated spirit. For several years across Europe, in Poland, Hungary, Germany, France, people have been looking to return to their fundamental character, which seemed to be disappearing. I believe in this spirit of the people. I believe in this force which resonates with them, and in the fact that these people are different, which is what gives us strength. The strength of the European people is that they are different people.
Marco Gombacci, what do Italians make of Emmanuel Macron?
Well, don't put me in crisis because my girlfriend is French, so I don't want to create a diplomatic problem in my house. So this is no. Apart from the jokes, I was a bit surprised about the fact that Macron spoke to Italian television and spoke about the European values, how much is important to strengthen the European Union. Because I was wondering when I was listening to the interview, what was he thinking when France was pushing back the migrants in Ventimiglia or in Bardonecchia border? I was thinking what Macron was thinking when he blocked the agreement between Fincantieri, the Italian shipping company, STX Cantiere Saint-Lazare. I was thinking what he was thinking when France, it was before his presidency, bombed Libya in 2011. So again, we are coming back to the real point. Is he trying to lead Europe for France's interest or for the European interest? Because as much as I can see, his own presidency is marked by representing the French interest and not the European interest. I recall the cover picture of The Economist, Macron, the savior of Europe. But until now, the European has a totally opposite idea about Emmanuel Macron. And Salvini, Di Maio, and all the politicians are criticizing, are strongly criticizing the French president, and they are using this attack on Italy for his own political campaign.
Picking up on what Jeremy Ghez
in the Italian television.
Picking up on what Jeremy Ghez was saying, you're saying that an interview like that one is good for Macron, good for Salvini, good for Di Maio, and bad for the traditional center-left and center-right parties in Italy.
Indeed, absolutely yes, because Macron, during this interview, was speaking to his own voters. In fact, my French colleagues say that these interviews had a good feedback in France. But in Italy was strongly criticized because he was speaking about European values, but until now the Italians saw that Macron was defending the French interest and not the European interest. So it was contradictory in what he was saying. And this was very good for Di Maio, was good for Salvini, was good in France for Macron, but for the traditional party that are trying to use a different narrative, it was very bad.
John O'Sullivan, are we witnessing the death of the traditional mainstream blocs?
No, we are witnessing their weakening. But what is very interesting here is, as my colleague just said, if all of the people think that they approve of a speech, that it gives something to them, then someone is misunderstanding what's happening. And I think what is happening is this, that Macron, attempting to relaunch Europe himself as the leader of Europe, that presented himself as responding to populist upsurges, responding to populist and nationalist politicians who were threatening the European idea. But what he was neglecting was that those populist upsurges are themselves a response to the failures of government, both the government from Brussels and the government from individual countries. And they're responding to the failure of the euro in Mediterranean Europe. They're responding to the crisis that was caused by Angela Merkel's invitation for people from Middle East and North Africa to enter Germany and therefore Europe. And they're responding in general to what they regard as the over-concentration of power in Brussels. And I didn't get any impression from our earlier discussion that there was a recognition of discontent. It seemed to me that when people say, can we afford this? Can we not afford to do it? This is an old fallacy which leads to utopian ideas and eventually to bankruptcies. I think we need more realism here.
Famke Krumbmuller, you've been watching the Yellow Vests protests, which have started since November. Do you agree with what John O'Sullivan said?
Well, I do think that Macron is especially trying to respond to this popular discontent because he picks up the issues that the populist nationalist parties, especially also in France, the National Front have been talking about, which is protecting Europe and European borders and migration and democracy and listening to the people. All of these issues have come back in his letter. So to me, it really looks like he's actually trying to show that he has heard that this is of major concern and that he's trying to provide an answer to it. Obviously, it will be difficult to cater to these demands as being a mainstream politician like he is at the end of the day. But I do think that he's responding to that.
What is certain is that politics is in flux and that on the night of May the 26th, we'll have a very different European Parliament, which brings us to the infighting going on within the outgoing Parliament, the majority bloc, the European People's Party. You too have a right to know what Brussels is preparing to do. That's what's written on those publicly funded billboards in Hungary. Prime Minister Orban says he'll be taking them down on March 15th, but to replace them with billboards featuring the Commission's first Vice President, Frans Timmermans, who's running for the Commission's top job as a Social Democrat. The European People's Party's president told Tuesday's edition of the German daily Die Welt that Viktor Orban had crossed the red line. Now, though, the EPP's candidate to replace Jean-Claude Juncker as Commission president, is ready to give Orban one last chance, it seems, ahead of debate on a possible exclusion of Orban's Fidesz party from the EPP on March 20th. Manfred Weber telling Bild newspaper in Germany that Orban must apologize. Where is this all going, John O'Sullivan?
Well, I don't think it's going to go anywhere immediately because it would be kind of like cutting off a limb to expel Fidesz from the EPP shortly before an election. That would be taken as a sign by a lot of people in other countries, of course, as well as Hungary, that the concerns of a very important part, almost half the population, presumably, about the failures of the past and about over-ambitious policies of centralization of the future, this would be seen as a sign that the EPP wasn't concerned about them. I think that simply doesn't make sense. Let me just make a general point here. Parties which stay in power for long periods and are parties which tolerate a good degree of internal debate and argument. The classic example being someone like the Liberal Party in Canada, for example. And I think that the EPP, if it is to remain one of the dominant parties, it's got to learn that same lesson. If it doesn't learn it, it's going to find that the party splinters. And there are many people outside Hungary who would not want, in a sense, to see Orban.
All right, but at what point?
He himself, of course.
Yeah, I was going to say, at what point is the red line? Let's listen to Viktor Orban. This was a speech he gave to the nation last month, denouncing an international conspiracy orchestrated from Brussels.
We too could do with some peace, but From the internationally, we also know that they will never rest, because, and again I quote them, this shall be the final struggle. Today also they are controlled from abroad. The stronghold of the new internationalism is in Brussels, and its means is immigration. Ladies and gentlemen, drawers in Brussels are full of plans, and if they are given a chance, they will deploy them.
So, John O'Sullivan, do you think that there's a conspiracy in Brussels to unleash immigrants on Hungary?
I think there are conspiracies in politics all the time. And there is no doubt that some political parties favor much more liberal immigration rules than others. I mean, I don't see that that's a conspiracy in the sense of something that would be against the law or part of some James Bond villain-like action. I just think it's the way politics works. And if you don't recognize that, you're not being realistic.
But he's talking about a new internationalism he's talking about a new internationalism using immigration as a tool for that internationalism.
Well, again, if you want to examine what's happened in Europe in the last 30 or 40 years, immigration, which started out simply as a way of bringing small numbers of workers in industries that found it hard to attract labor, has become a much bigger enterprise. And so naturally, if the voters don't want to see their country significantly changed, or if they think that bringing in low-wage migrants is likely to make conditions for the native-born workers at the bottom of the pile more difficult, they're going to organize and try to fight it. It is clearly the case that if you look at the statements of leading European politicians, that they have favored policies of much more liberal immigration than many of the people in their electorates want. And it's unrealistic to think that the voters won't respond to that.
Jeremy Ghez?
I mean, I think those are legitimate points, and I think the response that you're seeing stem from legitimate fears. And I also agree that there has to be a debate over what protection actually means. In my opinion, and this is where, by the way, Emmanuel Macron doesn't go far enough, there is the old traditional approach to protection. So the frontiers, the legislation you can undertake to protect jobs, and that populists value very much. And there's another form of protection, which basically means, look, trying to protect you eternally and protect your jobs eternally, that's never going to work. But what I can do instead is try to protect you, the individual, to try to provide you, and perhaps even more importantly, the future generation, your children, with all of the skills and all of the tools you need to survive in this globalization world. If you frame that debate that way, the immigration side is important, but it's not as significant as the traditional right-wing approach to this issue actually suggests. I am in no way saying that the cultural insecurity that many people feel, especially when they feel socially demoted, especially when they feel that they've lost their status, their social status, is absolutely illegitimate. Saying such a thing would lead to the success of Viktor Orban and Matteo Salvini. But you have to basically try to be realistic and look for new solutions and try to redefine what protection actually means. And today, I think there's plenty, this is me putting my educator hat on, plenty of opportunities in education, plenty of opportunities in terms of trying to find new business models and try to create a new impulse that I don't think we've tried to go to in Europe so far.
Drawers in Brussels, or I'm quoting here what Viktor Orban said, that do you think that there are drawers in Brussels full of plans?
Oh, of course not. Of course.
But I think that's the real point, because I don't think anybody is saying that Orban doesn't have a point when he talks about the fact that migration is a problem, etc. I don't think this is a content problem as such. It's a style problem. It's a values problem. It's the way that he expresses himself.
Did he cross the red line?
Well, that's, I think, what the EPP is now facing as a dilemma, especially the CSU and CDU, the German parties, who have the power to to decide a lot on this, and who are also the ones that will lose if they kick Orban's party out, because Weber is obviously trying to become the next Commission president.
You could add to that list, by the way, France's Les Républicains party, also a member of the EPP.
Have kept quiet.
Their leader of their party said it was regretful, but he's not calling for the ouster of Viktor Orban's Fidesz.
Because they need them, ironically. But that's kind of the dilemma that they face right now, because the red line has maybe almost been crossed, and obviously these are center-right European political parties who are defending a certain set of values, and even though there has to be a debate about the issues, the values need to be common to a certain extent, and talking about conspiracy in Brussels is problematic for them, and that's why, and anti-Semitic comments as well. Obviously, that's where the Germans now really feel like they have to react, and that's the fundamental debate. I don't think we're debating the fact that migration has put a huge pressure on European nation states.
Fully agreed. And just in one word, instead of rushing to the controversy, it might be time as well for other parties to develop far more realistic policies and solutions, rather than just basically being very much, excuse me, I'm losing my English here, but very much shocked by these words. I think being shocked isn't enough in terms of policy responses and in terms of expectations of the people who actually vote for them, ultimately.
A poll of polls published by Politico.eu still has the EPP coming out tops in European elections, that centre-right voting bloc we're talking about. But with a loss, you see those blue dots there towards the center-right of your screen. But with a loss of some 45 seats, and the EPP's total that you see on the screen includes the expected 13 seats of Fidesz. Marco Gombacci, what future for blocs like the EPP or the Social Democrats in the European Parliament?
Yeah, but let me clarify something that I heard before. Orban's critics against Soros cannot be called anti-Semitic comments. It's a critics against the Soros vision of the world, and they are legitimate. It's not something anti-Semitic. I remember that one of the states that are fighting against Soros is as well Israel, so I would not call this anti-Semitism. And the second point that I would like to point out is that the real question the TPP should ask to itself is what Orban will do after. Orban can be the only one who can unite the so-called sovereignist or populist parties around one name. So even if the EPP will lose a lot of seats, the socialists will lose a lot of seats, the liberal will increase, so it's likely that in the next European Parliament we will have a coalition made by three different parties, EPP, Socialists and Liberals. That means that if the sovereignists and the populists are united, they can make a lot of pressure against this new coalition which will run the European Union. So I don't think that it is in the interest of the EPP to let Orban out and to let Orban run a different group of parties against a different vision of Europe, because within the EPP, there are two different visions. There are the parties from Northern Europe that are more liberals, while other countries, like, as you mentioned before, the Républicains in France, the Spanish PP, Forza Italia in Italy, that are closer to Orban than what they are closer to some EPP from Finland, Sweden, or Netherlands. This is also a very important point. There is a huge difference between different EPP members.
Yeah, it's been a bad week for Les Républicains in France, Jeremy Ghez. Sorry, go ahead, John O'Sullivan.
Yeah, well, I think there's another element in this, just to add to what has been said, which is that a lot of people on the centre-right are nervous on a different range of issues. They're worried about the social democratization of the Christian Democrats, a phrase from German politics, but nonetheless applying across Europe, in which the parties of the centre-right increasingly lose touch with a large element of their own supporters, not only on nationalist grounds, not only on populist grounds, but also on moral or religious and cultural grounds. That's a very important point, because it's gone under the radar. And yet I know personally a number of people in European politics who regret the way in which the Christian Democrats, in a sense, have drifted from those original moral underpinnings and are opening the way to a different sort of politics. I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing populism. It's got a cultural and religious element as well as a national one.
Opening in which way? Because we've seen, for instance, in Germany, John, splits between Christian Democrats, some who want a tougher stance on issues like immigration, and others who feel there's not enough compassion.
Well, of course, there are always going to be serious debates among different blocs of Christians about the way the words of Christ should be interpreted in practical questions. We must always expect that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way in which a party which, after the war, was clearly founded on respect for Christian ideas and Christian culture, has gradually become just another liberal party. And that's something which concerns people, but those concerns have been missed by the majority of people. I would think, for example, that had the centre-right candidate in the French presidential elections not exploded himself, he would have fought a campaign that appealed to some extent to those old cultural and religious concerns. But of course, when he disappeared, that wasn't the interest of the National Front or of Macron.
Famke Krumbmuller, because we've heard remarks by Viktor Orban and some other Eastern European leaders talking about how Europe must defend Christian values.
Well, I think to zoom out to a certain extent, the broader issue of the more centrist traditional European parties in every European country is to redefine and readapt to the evolution of society and therefore of their electorate. And it has been complicated, and parts of the parties want to stick to what has worked in the past. Other parts want to move forward and adapt maybe to a younger and new electorate. And clearly, for example, in Germany, the CDU-CSU is facing these pressures. Are they sticking to a more conservative
right?
discourse?
What does it mean when Germany's Christian Democratic Union Party, the CDU, has the word Christian in its name? What does it mean today in 2019?
But that's exactly the question. That's what they're trying to redefine, and where there are really different parts within the party going into very different directions. I think a generational issue is at stake here as well. And you can see it in Germany where, for example, the young and more urban population is starting to vote for the Greens because they feel like they represent their issues more. So the CDU was debating, do they need to respond more to these types of concerns? Do they stick to the more conservative center-right traditional issues? And this has been extremely challenging, and we're going through this transformation right now, I'd argue.
And here in France, same thing. We have the far right, which is slated to do very well in the European elections, as are the Greens, which only have a handful of seats in the French parliament.
Yeah, it's the reshuffling of the political deal that started with Emmanuel Macron, but that's only continuing. And therefore, he should be very careful with this because he could become a victim of the process he launched. But I think that on the right, again, they are talking in the name of a population that we can't possibly ignore, that has a lot of legitimate fears, that translate into a discourse that is extremely preoccupying, that I think doesn't stand for European values, that doesn't stand for what this country represents, and that doesn't stand for what we've been trying to accomplish inside the European Union. So the real challenge on the right and on the left is to basically tell us in this country, but I think even beyond the detractors of Emmanuel Macron, what do they stand for in terms of policy? How is this basically changing from what they've tried over and over, and that has failed over time? This, to me, is not very clear on any part, but at least Emmanuel Macron has an advantage, a political advantage, I think, to appeal to a generation who is probably very much disillusioned with former recipes, but that is willing to listen. If he disappoints them, then I would be extremely worried about what happens next.
All right, and we'll see as this campaign kicks into high gear. I want to thank you, Jeremy Ghez. I want to thank Famke Krumbmuller. I want to thank as well Marco Gombacci for joining us from Brussels, John O'Sullivan from Budapest. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.